Welcome to today's presentation. My name is Katie Allen from the Institute for Community Inclusion, and this is our final panel in our Autism Speaker Series. And I just want to start by sharing a poll with you so that you can answer this first question and let us know who you are. So we're going to share that poll. And so for all of you who are attending now, you can answer this question. Let us know how you identify so we can get a sense of who's in the room. And I'm just going to go over a few things about Zoom also before we get started. So let me share this with you. I'll keep this poll open here for just a few more minutes. So this is our final webinar on emerging topics, and we have 4 panelists here with you today to present on their research and their reflections and their experiences. So before we get started, I just want you to know, as participants, you are automatically muted. You're not on camera like we all are here. So don't have to worry about finding your mute button or your camera, but the black bar at the bottom or top of your screen, depending on what your screen looks like, is your control panel. And there you can see the chat box feature, which this little chat bubble, if you click on that, you can type your questions and comments throughout the presentation there, and that will show up on the side of your screen. And just to be sure, this is really important, to be sure we can all see your questions and comments, you'll select all panelists and attendees as the option so that we can see all of your questions and comments. It will default to just panelists, but so that everyone can see, make sure you select all panelists and attendees. And tomorrow you will receive an email with a link to the evaluation for this webinar. And if you are looking to get CRC credits for participating, Certified Rehabilitation Counselor credits, you will want to take this evaluation in order to get your credits. So we're just going to share the results of the poll. And it looks like we have a lot of agency staff here. It seems like the largest group. We have about 6% of people identify as autistic, and 28% of people are advocates. We've got some support providers, family members as well, and a few researchers and teachers. So thank you for taking our poll.
And I'd assume there's some people in there with multiple identities.
Definitely.
Do they can only choose one, or do they choose?
I believe people had the option of choosing multiple.
Okay.
There. So, and again, if you need captioning, Rebecca shared that in the chat box. So that is also the link on your screen right now. And I just want to introduce our presenters before we get started. And then after I introduce our presenters, I'm going to turn it over to our director, Tom, who will give a little more background on this series. So I'm just going to read their bios in order of alphabet. So starting with Sara María Acevedo, is an autistic mestiza, educator, and disability justice advocate born and raised in Colombia. Her background is in linguistics, disability studies, and activist anthropology. Sara is founding member of the Coalición Nacional para Latinxs con Discapacidades, or the National Coalition for Latinx with Disabilities, and a newly elected board member for the Society for Disability Studies. And Sara will discuss the benefits and challenges of disclosing one's autistic identity and bridging the languages of academia and grassroots spaces. And then next we have our panelist, Lydia XZ Brown, who's a Juris Doctorate, and a disability justice advocate, organizer, and writer, whose work has largely focused on the violence against multiply marginalized disabled people, especially institutionalization, incarceration, and policing. They're a public interest law scholar and recent graduate from Northeastern University School of Law, where they served as an active member of the Committee Against Institutional Racism, representing the Asian Pacific American Law Students Association, the Transgender Justice Task Force, and the Faculty Appointments Committee. And they're a founding core collective member of the Disability Justice Caucus. They also serve as a founding board member of the Alliance for Citizen-Directed Services, stakeholder representative to the Massachusetts One Care Implementation Council, which oversees healthcare for Medicaid and Medicare dually eligible individuals, and a board member of the Autism Women's Network. And next we have Caro Nardi, who's in the room here with me now. Hello. And Caro is a PhD candidate here at the University of Massachusetts in Boston, School of Global Inclusion and Social Development. Caro also holds a Master of Public Policy from the Heller School at Brandeis University. Caro's research is focused on the experiences of autistic transgender youth and how they seek and experience medical care. And we finally, last but not least, have Hala O'Keefe, also in the room here. Hala is the founding director of the Inclusion Advocacy Collaborative, a nonprofit organization formed to address the intersection of disability rights, special education, and economic justice. Hala has worked as a parent advocate, assisting parents in navigating the special education system in Massachusetts. She's also an ambassador for the Autism Self-Advocacy Network and a Barbara Walensky Gopin Fellow here at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. So I am going to now turn it over to our director, Tom, who will discuss the background of our webinar series.
Great. Thank you very much, Katie. Thank you for teeing this up. My name is Tom Santacandro, and I'm the director of the Institute for Community Inclusion that is based at UMass Boston as well as Children's Hospital. This series is part of the celebration of our 50th anniversary of the Institute for Community Inclusion. And we thought a good way to celebrate would be to have an educational speaker series that would be informative, as well as to showcase the expertise of the Institute for Community Inclusion. And this series is a chance for us to get beyond common stereotypes around autism and to open up a much richer conversation. Today, our panelists will be discussing emergent topics in autism. The format is going to be slightly different, and Katie's going to tell you about that, but I'm very excited about today's topic. I believe we are at the cutting edge with what we're talking about today, so I can't wait to hear what the panelists have to say and see the kind of discussion we're going to get from this. So thank you, everybody. I'm going to turn it back to you, Katie.
Thank you, Tom. So as Tom said, this will be a little bit different today. Typically we would have a Q&A panel session, but today we're going to have 4 experts present on their research and their experiences. And I introduced them earlier, so we're going to start today with Sara. And so I'm going to turn it over to you, Sara. And then each presenter will present for 15 minutes. And at the end, we will have questions and answers. So during the presentation, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to type them in the chat box, and we will get to those at the end of all of the presentations. So Sara, take it away.
Okay, hello everybody. I'm not going to introduce myself because you already did that for me, Katie. So what I'm going to do is I am going to share my screen. So the title of my presentation is Autism and Self-Narration, Positionality, Disclosure, and Collective Meaning Making. And so what I did was actually just like, what I'm going to do is actually take you through a little bit of a sort of overview of each of these terms that I've chosen for this presentation, except for the term autism. And so here we go. So what I will tell you before is that the term autism and the autistic identity, of course, is tied to all of these different concepts that I'm going to take you through in every single way. And I'm gonna do so from a personal and lived and embodied perspective of autism. So I've been thinking a lot about self-narration lately. I started working with autistic core researchers for my dissertation 3 years ago. And one of the most important things that we discussed and that came up from our collaborative work together was definitely the idea of self-representation. Self-representation, self-authorship, and self-narration. So telling our stories, telling our own stories and living our stories through narration. So what I think about this is that when we tell our stories, we're not only challenging the status quo and what is said about us and our lived experiences and embodied expressions, but we're actually contributing to transforming those. And we are doing so by disrupting what is commonly understood and the assumptions that are made around different forms of embodiment. So because this often happens in collectivity, but it is a collectivity like meaning making, but it is a collectivity that does not necessarily readily incorporate us. The stories that are told about us are generally stories without us. So what I'm doing, what I show you here at the bottom is the sort of the source where this comes from for the disability community, and that's Jim Charlton, Nothing About Us Without Us, Disability, Oppression, and Empowerment. And sort of like to really point to the importance of self-representation and self-narration within every collective movement for liberation. This is especially the case for disabled people in the various disability communities, and where our voices just have been represented as unintelligible and unimportant. Positionality. The concept of positionality is really important in terms of how you understand your role, your own participation in the creation of value systems and in the reproduction of ideologies, right? And how that works in terms of creating collective meaning making and consensus around our social, cultural, and political lives in the everyday. So what I'm bringing to you today is the idea that positioning oneself is important, not only in terms of like our social location, not only in terms of the identities we claim, both socially and bodily identities, but also how we situate ourselves, like how we are situated within the hierarchy or social hierarchy of knowledge production, and sort of what is the cultural and political impact of situating ourselves within this hierarchy of knowledge production. So an example of that for myself is I am an academic, and I am aware of the different sites of privilege that I embody and that I occupy and that I inhabit. And so for me, always being clear and transparent about my stance and where I'm coming from when I talk about these things is really important. So positioning myself within a hierarchy of knowledge production is my responsibility. It is an ethical call when discussing issues that touch the lives of marginalized communities. Disclosure. This is a big topic, and it's a big thing, and it's been very present in my life for the past 3 years. And of course, the implications of disclosure are multiple, and the ways in which our bodies are either targeted or not in terms of disclosure have a lot to do with, of course, what Lydia is going to talk about later on, the intersections of race, class, gender expression, sexual orientation, ethnicity, citizenship status, and so on. So disclosure is a political act, and is not something that is just inconsequential. There is a lot that happens when you disclose, and that of course depends on your positionality, your identity, and the context in which you're disclosing your identity. So I think that this disclosure, though, is so important because it really opens a space of contestation. And that space of contestation really disrupt assumptions and challenges dominant narratives and ideas about other bodies. So when there is disclosure, we are entering the conversation from a political standpoint. So it is a politicizing discourse. It is a political move. to disclose, but it is not inconsequential. And there are, of course, not only structural, symbolic, but also physical risks involved in disclosing. In collective meaning making, so I always think about ways in which when we come together to reclaim some sort of social, cultural, or political process, and we're collectivizing and organizing around, again, disrupting dominant understandings of disability. In this case, we're talking about the embodied expression and lived experience of autism. There is a lot to do in terms of how we build solidarity and how we develop solidarity. And thinking about solidarity is not, is a difficult endeavor as well as practicing solidarity at the intersections of multiple oppressions, because that's not always something that is ideal or possible in every context. But thinking in terms of how solidarity can be developed across movements and across constituencies is really important. And how we understand solidarity is also important. So solidarity has different meanings, of course, but I'm thinking mostly in terms of how grassroots politicized communities describe solidarity. And so this speaks to what is commonly known as allyship, although I dislike the term, and I prefer to think in terms of political companionship. And so how are we told that we are, that we can benefit or that we can advance social movements in terms of like how we position ourselves? So for me as an academic, I am, as the Zapatista says, leading by obeying. So I come to gather with grassroots knowledge producers, and I am not coming to say, I am an expert here. No, I am coming to say, I am here to listen and to understand how it is that you represent solidarity, and solidarity in terms of what I can bring to this movement from the position that I occupy within the academy and the privilege that, the institutional privilege that grants me. And that's important in terms of how how autistic people positioned differently in social contexts can come together to disrupt oppressive understandings and practices around autism and autistic people. How am I doing on time, Katie?
You're doing great. You have about 6 minutes.
Oh, great. Okay. So what I did was, for the end, because we don't have a lot of time for each of our presentations, I wanted to take you briefly through the overview, and then I had some points of discussion that participants can use perhaps to guide their questions or not, but I just wanted to bring this kind of a summary together. So I describe self-narration as a political and cultural process that upsets and often transforms dominant ideas and representations of other bodies, other forms of embodiment, and other identities. In this case, self-narration around autistic identities is as powerful as any other form of self-narration around disability or any other marker of identity and different embodiment. Then I think about positioning oneself, again, not only in terms of the different intersecting social and bodily identities that one inhabits. And I'll give you an example. For instance, I am a mestiza, autistic woman, immigrant, and I'm also an academic with who experiences lateral privilege and has institutional access. So sort of navigating those sometimes or often contradictory sites of experience and is really important, and especially in terms of how those identities influence knowledge production, and that is very necessary. What does it mean that I'm autistic and I'm a woman and I'm a woman of color and I'm also an immigrant, but what does it mean that I do have access to the institution and that I do have access to influencing how knowledge production works within the academy? So I think that this is that working toward ethically responsible social movements necessitates ongoing self-reflection. Who am I? How am I positioned? What's my role? What are the sites of privilege that I occupy? And how are those in constant conversation or dialogue with the sites of oppression that I embody? Then I'm just bringing the whole idea of disclosure as a political endeavor once again. So I'm emphasizing here on how when we disclose outside the parameters established by the law, for instance, those parameters that are protected by confidentiality acts such as FERPA, we risk targeting and institutional violence, and that's actually been the case for me. When utilizing disclosure as a political tool, it is key to understand that you will be subject to institutional power dynamics, and that those institutional power dynamics have very real and concrete effects on your everything, on your emotional, mental, physical, intellectual, financial situation, and that it's also something that furthers autism, that furthers self-narration and self-representation for me as an autistic person. And so how that shows up for me in the classroom is really powerful. And that's, I know it because of the affect of the room, sort of the conversations that are generated in between my students, and also through their evaluations. There is invariably an emphasis on how the centering of my lived experience, of my personal identity in connection to the movements, to the grassroots movements that I'm involved with, how that influences the learning in the classroom, and how students can access concepts that are otherwise abstract through sort of vicariously through the lived experiences that I relate. So then I guess the last thing that I say is that in a world that prioritizes medical and professional understandings and practices over our own embodied experiences, after all, we are the real experts of our lives. Collective meaning making is actually revolutionary, because collective meaning making means that we exist and that we resist and that we are here. And there are, of course, a range of possibilities as well as limitations when doing so. And this is actually the last thing I'll say, and it'll touch on bridging academic language and grassroots language and the codes that are produced in everyday life struggles, and sort of the way that those collide. So this was, of course, the case for my dissertation research. Like I said before, I conducted collaborative horizontal research with two autistic grassroots educators and transition service providers in Berkeley, California. And our coming together was in many ways a very prolific and generous explosion and collusion of languages, which of course gave way to the creation of a third space and a third kind of coded language that we created together. So whatever I came from with the institution was oppressive and inaccessible because of the nature of the language that academia utilizes and privileges and legitimizes, and the kind of language that grassroots knowledge producers are developing in turn, right? So there are two very different temporalities to the creation of that language. Whereas academics, we live kind of within this like atemporal space where we discuss social movements. Are they as they are happening? You know, there is this temporality that is kind of in suspension, versus the temporality of grassroots movements, which is always in motion and it never stops. It never stops, really. The violence never stops. And so the fact that academics have time to think about and theorize violence that is years light ahead of those theories is of those movements is an important thing to think about. So when bringing quote unquote expertise from the academy, you are bound as a researcher to be undone and to be decentered and to be sort of fragmented in your identity as an expert. And I think that that's the most important, that's the biggest value of collaborative research. That's it. How did I do on time?
Thank you. That was actually perfect timing.
Great.
Right on time. So that was Dr. Sara María Acevedo, and we'll take questions at the end again. So thank you so much, Sara. And now we're going to turn it over to Lydia XC Brown, who I introduced, and Lydia will discuss intersections of race and autism, specifically about concerns that impact autistic people of color that don't affect white autistic people. So.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope that you are doing at least as minimally okay as is possible. I know that in the times that we live in, especially for those of us here who live at one or more margins in society, that things can feel difficult or sometimes even completely impossible. And so I want to take a moment to give ourselves some grounding space. I usually do this when I'm in the room with people, facilitating or co-leading, but I want to do that even though we're sort of virtually meeting online. Oh, and Sara, would you mind? Oh, there you are. Great. And what I want to ask us to do is to take a moment to ground ourselves on where we're at, to meet ourselves where we're at, tune in to what our own bodies and minds are telling us, tune in and allow ourselves to connect with whatever it is that we've brought with us, our anger, our fear, our excitement, our joy, our hopes, our anxiety, our rage, our desperation, our awareness, our exhaustion, to give ourselves permission to tune in and pause and not worry about whether you're catching some topics or concepts that I'm saying. Let's just take a second, pause and ground ourselves where we are. Thank you for taking that time with me. I counted, that was 10 seconds. And for some of us, that might have felt absurdly, painfully long. And for others of us, you might be thinking, wait, you just said that was 10 seconds. How was that 10 seconds? That was like a second, but I timed it. And, you know, very much drawing off of what Sara has been talking about, how we exist, even occupying space or time as autistic people, especially those of us who are autistic and disabled in other ways, can be complicated. And we can really screw with time. It's, you know, just timey-wimey, wibbly-wobbly stuff. And I want to acknowledge that I and many of you are not necessarily in the best headspace. The topic that I'm here to discuss with you today is that of autism and race. I don't recognize many of the names of the folks who are here joining us. I scrolled through to see who is present today. And so for those of you who don't know me, and besides the introduction that Katie shared, I am autistic and I'm an East Asian person. And because I live as an autistic person of color in a world where dominant discourse about autism, representation everywhere, in media, in research, in public policy, every aspect of society, discourse about autism is dominated by the image of white autistic men or boys. White autistic men or boys. That means that this topic is deeply personal to me. It touches on my life experiences, but it also is integral to all of the work that I do, the work in my life. And I want to start by framing this conversation. So I'm going to see if I can share my screen, and we're going to see if my advice to Sara actually works. And if it pops up. There we go.
Yeah.
You all see this?
Yes.
Are you all seeing this?
Yes.
Great. Okay, perfect. So I want to start by introducing the concept of intersectionality. I don't have the ability, I don't think, to create a poll, so I don't really have a way of asking of the 80 plus folks that are with us, how many of you are familiar with this term or not. For those of you who already know about this, I'm sorry, the next few minutes are kind of 101. For those of you who don't know about this, I'm not sorry, because we need to talk about this. The term intersectionality first entered public conversation in the early 1990s when Professor Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, the person whose face is on this slide, introduced the term in her paper, Mapping the Margins, Intersectionality, Identity Politics, and Violence Against Women of Color. And she used this term to describe the particular forms of discrimination as one way that oppression can manifest, that targeted Black women. A type of oppression that couldn't be explained simply by talking about sexism or by simply talking about racism, since Black men's experiences with racism and white women's experiences with sexism were both completely different than the experiences of the Black women who were affected by a combination of the two. And that word combination is important. That's why intersection is used. It means a crossing, where things cross and connect. Because intersectionality isn't simply where you add 1 + 1. A person happened to be Black and a woman. A person happens to be autistic and non-white, a person of color. But rather what happens when those experiences blend together to create particular and unique forms of oppression. Since the time that Professor Crenshaw published this paper, she and many others have expanded conversation about what intersectionality means as a framework for understanding social and political issues. And in real people terms, what it means for understanding our lives, our lived experience. I had the privilege of hearing Professor Crenshaw speak earlier this year, and she spoke about the importance and the urgency of doing intersectional work, of not forgetting that this word means something that is very different than when we talk about diversity or inclusion or equity as buzzwords. This is, again, 101 to some of us. Diversity, inclusion, and equity don't even mean the same thing as each other, and they certainly don't mean the same thing as intersectionality. I will add as a side note, it is a pet peeve of mine when people ask me, hey, Lydia, would you participate in our board or our conference? Because we need some intersectional voices. And I'm like, what you mean is you want a non-white token, right?
Yeah.
Just say it, admit it. I have a t-shirt, I'm not wearing it now, unfortunately. It says, I am not a token. I love that shirt. And what they really mean is we want speakers that are more diverse than a panel of pale, stale, and male speakers. That's what my friend Victoria Rodriguez Roldan says, pale, stale, and male. So the term intersectionality helps frame the work that I'm doing and that I want you all to think about and to begin to practice. It means recognizing that whenever there are humans, there are multiple identities and experiences at play that collide and blend into one another. Not a single one of us has one identity or one experience. And that's true for all of us. That's true no matter what your gender is, no matter what your race is, whether you're autistic or not, have any disability or none at all. We all have many identities. And so it's like what Audre Lorde tells us. We can't do single issue politics because we don't live single issue lives. When we talk about autism and race together, it means that we have to be approaching it with an analysis of what oppression is in society. Disability oppression, what happens to us, is ableism. You might have heard other terms for this, ableism, disableism, disability oppression. They all mean essentially the same thing. We don't have time, nor do I have the desire to go into a long semantic argument about which term is better. They mean the same thing. We're talking about disability oppression. All that ableism is an entire system of thinking and doing that hurts disabled people or people with disabilities. It's a form of structural oppression. What does that mean? It means that in our society, there are power differentials. There are groups of people based on some arbitrary characteristic or trait that have social, political, and economic power in society at the direct expense of people who don't belong to that group or people who belong to a different group from that. In the case of disability, how this plays out is people that are considered functional and healthy and whole who are valuable, worthy, and desirable are given privilege and power and resources, and people who are considered sick, unhealthy, defective, or less than, people who are broken and need to be fixed, are exploited, are erased, and are targeted for all forms of violence. And that's what ableism does. That's really all it means. Ableism at its core is racist, it is anti-Black, it is capitalist, and it is eugenicist. Disability oppression depends upon all of these systems of power, domination, and violence in our society. You can't separate them. And that's really what that means. When I say oppression, power differential, you can call it different things. These are aspects of what that looks like in practice. It's prejudice, it's bias, it's bigotry, it's hate sometimes, not always, but often it's hate. Sometimes it's fear, sometimes it's pity, it's power. These are all part of what makes oppression what it is. Mia Mingus tells us that ableism is connected to all of our struggles because it undergirds notions of whose bodies are considered valuable, desirable, and disposable. Valuable, desirable, and disposable. And that is the crux of the matter. Disability oppression is inextricably tied to racial oppression because all oppression is connected, but it is not the same. All oppression is connected, but it's not the same. White supremacy can only exist by using ableist ideas. The idea that people of color, especially if you're Black, brown, or Latinx, are somehow inferior individually or civilizationally to white people is a disability metaphor. It's saying that the bodies and brains of people of color are less than the bodies and brains of white people. This was the discourse that happened to my ancestors in the turn of the century, the 20th century. There were a number of political cartoons. It was very popular on the West Coast to publish political cartoons stoking anti-immigration fears about the dangers and the terrible scariness of Asian immigrants, especially Chinese and Japanese immigrants, in which we were depicted as emasculated men that had chimpanzee-like appearances that were a sexual menace to white women. Very similar imagery to our long and storied history of anti-Blackness in this country. And all of it is wrapped up in ideas about bodies and brains. That's why I say this is all connected. Disability oppression is connected to racial oppression. But our struggles are not the same because autistic people who are white wouldn't experience ableism at all if ableism and racism were actually the same thing. Does that make sense? I realize that people are not unmuted. That was an unhelpful question, sorry. But what I mean to say, of course, is that racism and ableism are always connected, they always work together, but they're not actually identical. So here are some of the specific issues that face autistic people of color that don't face white people. And this is really the meat of the presentation that probably everyone was waiting for. Autistic people of color face extraordinary rates of school pushout. Department of Education civil rights data shows that if you are a student with disabilities and if you are a student of color, particularly if you're Black or Latinx, that you face the highest rates of restraint, seclusion, suspensions, and expulsions of any other student demographic in the country. The Judge Rotenberg Center in Massachusetts, which is the only institution in the entire country that we know about that uses painful electric shock as a form of behavior modification, began doing that in 1988, first opened in 1971. Its population is 75% people of color. 73+% are Black or Latinx. 73+% are Black or Latinx. 75% of all groups of people of color combined together. That's the Judge Rotenberg Center's racial makeup. And that's not a fact that many folks, including people who've been doing this work for a long time, will acknowledge. Or perhaps some folks aren't aware of it. And yet that is a key example of what happens when disability and race collide. Talila Lewis says that race and disability is the most dangerous intersection that history has ever created. Autistic people who are the most likely to be able to access augmentative and alternative communication are white autistic people. Autistic people who are the most likely to be employed are white autistic people. Autistic people who are the most likely to be able to gain any of the positions that Sarah is talking about, to go to college, to get a degree, to get an advanced degree, are white autistic people. Sarah and I are anomalies. Autistic people overall, if you include white and people of color into that group, face some of the highest unemployment rates. We're one of a handful of demographics where for every layer of educational attainment we reach, we have a higher rate of unemployment. We're not the only group, but we're one of them. Every time an autistic person gains a level of education, the likelihood that that person will be employed drops. You combine that with race, that statistic, I don't know the specific number, I don't do math, I went to law school because I can't do math. I don't want to imagine or contemplate what that is with every level of educational attainment. Disabled people of color, especially Black and Indigenous disabled people, are the most likely to be targeted for police violence, for criminalization, and for incarceration. Helping Educate to Advance the Rights of Deaf Communities estimates that somewhere between 70 to 80% of all people who are killed by police, and a similar statistic of all people who are in prisons, are either deaf or have a disability. So if you are Black or Indigenous and you have a disability, particularly mental disabilities, like all of us as autistic people, then you are the most likely person to be targeted for that kind of violence. And then, you know, this expands everywhere. It doesn't have to be overt violence. It can be the subtle everyday violence that the people who are the most famous, who are for being autistic, they're white people. They've done things with their life. I'm not denying that. I'm not here arguing to you that none of them don't deserve recognition for their actual work, but the names that come to everyone's minds, Temple Grandin, Stephen Shore, John Elder Robeson, they're all white people. And that is a crisis of representation. The stereotype of what an autistic person looks like in TV and movies, white man, who follows a very particular pattern. They're somewhere in the STEM field, they're white, they're male, and they're socially awkward in a very particular way, and their only goal is to get a girlfriend. Kassiana Asasumasu writes about this, the idea that autistic women and people that are perceived as women only exist, apparently, to be the perfect fantasy partner for autistic men. It's on Kassiana's blog, timetolisten.blogspot.com. There's an excellent article about this. And so in every sphere, autistic people of color are constantly left behind. And what I really hope that you're getting out of this is that whatever it is you're doing, I know that the majority of people in the poll said that your program or provider staff, you're at an agency, is to consider where is your agency, your program, your organization failing us? It's not merely are there autistic people on your staff, but are there autistic people in management? Are there autistic people in a decision-making position on your board? Are those autistic people all white? Are they pale, stale, and male? Are there autistic people involved with your organization that are not merely there so they can get a pat on the shoulder and a $20 stipend? Are there autistic people there who you actually listen to as peers and as experts? As peers and as experts. And are all those autistic people the white ones? When you are thinking about what does an appropriate adult services support plan look like, did you put in there as a goal be able to comply with emergency personnel and follow orders from police? Because if you did, you're setting up Black and Indigenous autistic people to die. So whatever level it is that you're working at, that you're operating at, autistic people of color are here. We are here to stay. There are issues that affect us that don't really affect white autistic people, or that affect us much more than affect white autistic people. And that if we're not careful to listen to learn from, that we're not going to be able to effectively address, let alone be working in effective allyship. If that is, in fact, what I hope that you would like to do since you're here right now. I want to close this. I know I'm basically out of time, with acknowledging that, you know, my perspective is also a limited one. I am a multiply marginalized person. I'm queer, I'm non-binary trans, I'm an East Asian person of color in addition to being autistic. And I also have a lot of privilege. I grew up middle class. I have a college education. I just finished law school. I'm a light-skinned person of color, which means that because of my race, the majority of people are not going to look at the color of my skin and see me as a threat. Doesn't mean I don't experience racism. It just means I don't experience that type of racism. And so please do not take this 15-minute discussion and translate that into, okay, we heard Lydia Brown for 15 minutes. We also heard Sara María Acevedo for 15 minutes. So we know everything about autism and race issues. Yay. You don't. Also, I don't. We're all learning, and we need to do that learning with each other. We need to support each other in it, because if we don't, no one will. So my final closing, I promised, I am ending, is to encourage you all, if your agency or you have the ability to support us in this work, I am part of a group that just launched an Autistic People of Color Fund. It's a fund for community reparations, empowerment and interdependence and survival for autistic people of color. And what we do with that fund is we give out money as direct, unrestricted grants to individuals. And already it's been open for only 8 days, and we've received over 50 applications, more than the number of states. And those applications have been for needs as diverse as needing to see a therapist, running out of medication, having a car repossessed, about to be evicted, someone who is starving, somebody who is on the brink of death, people who are in desperate need of being able to keep a medical appointment, people who are in need of rent, people who would like scholarship money. And we're going to run out of funds pretty quickly, because these are the needs coming from autistic people of color. So if you have the ability to support us in doing that work, I will share a link with our chat for this webinar, but these are some of the issues that those of us who are autistic people of color across our communities are struggling with. And this is where we could use your support and your solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lydia. That was excellent and very informative. We really appreciate that. And we'd love to share your presentation on the website as well. So if you could send those to me before, after the presentation, and please share the links. Any presenters or anyone who's attending, share your links in the chat box with us so that we can find more information. So I'm going to turn it over now to Caro Narby, who will present the research on adolescents who are autistic and transgender and their experiences accessing medical care. And we're going to do a quick screen switch here, so it'll be just a moment.
So I'm just trying to share my PowerPoint.
Yeah, you might want to click out of it first.
So out here.
Open the window first. Okay,
Hi everybody. I just want to thank everyone again for attending this webinar, and I'm just getting set up.
And now if you go back to Zoom. Okay. And Google Chrome.
Great. All right. Ooh, I'm having a hard time seeing. So actually, I don't know. So that's all I need to do.
Oh, excellent.
All right. Sorry, I didn't bring my glasses today. So yeah, I'm Karen Arby, and today what I'm going to be talking about is a specific research project that I'm working on. And this is my dissertation project, and it's moving along gradually. I actually just heard back from the IRB at UMass Boston, and I need to make some adjustments and clarifications within my protocol, and then sort of reapply for IRB approval. Yeah, that's the current state of the study, and as I said, it's sort of gradually moving forward, and I'll be describing it today for you. So just as an overview of what I'll be talking about in this presentation, I'll talk a little bit about who I am. I'll give some background and context for the work that I intend to do, and then I'll just get right into the project overview. So let's get right to it. I am a PhD candidate here at the School for Global Inclusion and Social Development, working on my dissertation, as I just said. And I'm also a research assistant with the State Systems team at the Institute for Community Inclusion. The State Systems team is essentially what it sounds like. We do research on state policy, and I specifically work around employment policy at the state level for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. I also am an autistic advocate, committed to promoting access and equity for vulnerable populations in healthcare. I just kind of wanted to reiterate today at this webinar that I'm coming to you really primarily in the capacity of a researcher and an early career professional. Certainly my autistic identity is important to me, but I think that in the discourse around autism, we tend to silo like family members, professionals and providers, and autistic advocates or self-advocates as if those are three discrete groups, when of course there are people who exist in intersections between those groups. So again, I'm approaching you as a researcher and professional, and I can, if there's time later, I can talk a little bit more about how I think about my identity and my experience as an autistic researcher. So just before I describe the design of my project, I want to briefly go over some findings from existing research that are really providing the context and the impetus for the work that I intend to do. There is a body of clinical research that suggests that there is a significant co-occurrence between gender dysphoria and autism, and there are multiple studies that have focused specifically on adolescent patients. So just to get into some numbers from study findings, this is from one study that suggests that up to 20% of individuals who express gender dysphoria also meet the diagnostic criteria for autism spectrum disorder. So again, a significant portion of the sample. Another study suggests that children and adolescents specifically who express gender dysphoria may be up to 10 times more likely to be autistic than their peers. And finally, just another number to throw at you, autistic adolescents. So this is sort of, we have data that suggests that children and adolescents who experience or express gender dysphoria are more likely than their peers to be autistic. The reverse is also true, that autistic adolescents may be 7.76 times more likely than their peers to experience gender dysphoria. So again, this is a small but growing body of research that suggests as I said, there's a significant co-occurrence between gender dysphoria and autism. And this is a population of patients that's gaining significant attention from clinicians and providers. And there is a set of initial clinical guidelines that were published in 2016 to approach and suggest that this patient population may have specific needs around access to an administration of gender-related healthcare. So that's really the context that I have in mind, that I had in mind when I designed the study and as I move forward with the study. The rationale for designing the project the way that I have is based on the fact that none of the existing studies that speak to this issue have included the voices and perspectives of patients themselves. And I think that the inclusion of patients as active participants is crucial to the development of any effective treatment paradigm. It's kind of going back to what Sara said about experts. People who are living a given experience are really the experts in their own lived experience. And that's the ethos that I'm bringing to the design of this study. So this is an exploratory study in which I'm trying to understand what participants are experiencing and how they understand and interpret their experiences. So the purpose officially is twofold. It's to understand how participants, for me to understand how participants understand the relationship between autism and gender dysphoria, and also to explore whether and how their understanding influences the relationship between patients and providers. So I'm specifically looking at autistic adolescents who are pursuing or undergoing medical treatment for gender dysphoria, medical treatments pertaining to gender transition. This project is guided by the following research questions. I will just read them just so folks have sort of the visual and the auditory input. So my first research question is, how do participants conceptualize the relationship between autism and gender dysphoria? How do participants' understandings about autism and gender dysphoria influence interactions between patients and providers? What are the similarities and differences in how autistic transgender adolescents, parents and guardians, and providers all conceptualize the relationship between autism and gender dysphoria? How do participants view and describe their experience of patient-provider engagement around medical transition? And finally, what are the similarities and differences in how autistic transgender adolescents, parents and guardians, and providers describe their experiences around receiving or administering transition-related medical care? So again, I'm really concerned with what stakeholders on the ground, that is patients, their parents and guardians, and providers, how all these different groups of stakeholders understand the interactions between patients and providers around transition-related care for this population of patients. Just flipping through my notes. So in order to ensure that my data is as detailed and rich and nuanced as I really want it to be, I will be recruiting a sample of participants that includes those 3 groups of stakeholders. So as I said, adolescents, parents and guardians, and medical providers who provide transition-related care and have adolescents, within their patient population. Data collection will take place in the form of semi-structured interviews that will be carried out in person, ideally here at ICI's Bayside office. And at the end of each interview, each participant will be asked if they would like to participate in an optional demographic survey. And the results of the survey will provide another layer of information that will enrich my data and enhance the final analysis. That kind of speaks to, trying to incorporate intersectionality into the design of the study. Certainly within the actual interview protocol, there's opportunity for participants to talk about their other aspects of their experience and their identity. But again, this demographic survey just adds an additional layer to the data so that it can be disaggregated according to demographic groups and sort of different identity categories that if necessary during the analysis. And then finally, after data collection is complete, participants will have the option of participating in a focus group during which they will be invited to provide feedback on my initial findings. And this is a form of member checking, and it's sort of trying to ensure that participants do have a voice in the actual analytic process. Ideally, I would be able to do like participatory action research, but unfortunately here at SCISD, we just don't have the resources either in terms of funding, time, or space to carry out true participatory action research where participants would be active collaborators in the design of the study. But I'm doing my best to ensure that there is input, active input from participants in the actual analysis. One of my goals for this project, one of the major goals, is that the findings will be directly useful to stakeholders in some way. So whether it's just helping young people to understand their own experiences in context, or to understand provider perspectives so that they can better navigate the medical system, or helping providers understand the perspectives of patients so that they can provide the best possible care, I really want to make sure that the products of the study include more than just the dissertation document or sort of academic materials that may not be accessible to or useful to the participants in the stakeholder population. So there's an array of different kinds of products that might be more accessible, might be more useful to the patients and to the people who want to support them. And these include, a variety of different formats. So webinars and trainings, pamphlets, a report that, is in plainer language and is more accessible, in addition to the dissertation document itself and any academic publications that I might end up contributing to the discourse. So that's the overview of my project. That's the bulk of what I'll talk about, but hopefully there will be space and time for further discussion and questions at the end. And I want to thank everybody for listening.
Thanks, Carol. That's excellent. And there will definitely be time for questions. I know some of them are coming in now. And before we move to our next and final panelist, it's just going to be a second here of technical rearranging. All right.
So I go to share screen and Microsoft PowerPoint. Can you guys all see my, you've got, and you should put it in
the, down at the bottom, where it's a little down here.
Oh, I see, yes.
That one.
Thank you. There we go.
All right.
Okay.
And let me just say before you begin, again, just because we've had some time since the introductions, this is Hala O'Keefe speaking about autistic parenting and how autistic communities and parenting communities can be more inclusive of autistic parents. And Hala also is writing a book, I believe that you mentioned.
I am planning, I'm in the planning stages.
Okay, so we'll get to that too. So take it away.
Okay, well, I have spoken to parent groups and groups of youth and young adults on this topic, but I have not given it in an academic context. So I'm going to ask you to forgive me for not being quite as erudite as the ones that have come before me. I've learned a great deal. So before we get started, I want to just say that I am probably going to be using language that might be unfamiliar to a couple of viewers, or it might not seem like the way to speak. For example, I use the term autistic or autistic person rather than person with autism, because I believe in identity first language rather than person first language. And this is all something that can be looked up if you wanted to Google the term identity first language. But I know that sometimes parents are nonplussed when they hear me doing it. I also use a number of other terms like autistic, which is a word that means non-autistic when we don't want to use neurotypical, because to use the word neurotypical might exclude some people who are neurodivergent in different ways but are not autistic. Moving on from there, the term neurodivergent, which was originally coined by Cassiana Asasumas, and it refers to someone who is literally neurodivergent, means different in the brain. And so it can be used to refer to someone with a physical, like cerebral palsy or a traumatic brain injury, but it's more often used to refer to someone who is autistic or psychiatrically disabled or with another learning disability. I just bring this up because you will hear me use these terms: autistic, think non-autistic, but not necessarily neurotypical. And if there's any other terms that I use that are unfamiliar, please ask me in the chat box and I will define them. So, I'm sorry, you can see my PowerPoint, but I can't see it. There we go. Why do we even need to have this conversation? Why do we need to talk about autistic parents? Well, first of all, because we exist. And the first people being diagnosed as being on the less apparently autistic to parents and professionals, I don't use functioning labels, but we would say higher functioning end of the spectrum, started being diagnosed around 92 or 93. And so many of these people are now parents. They're now raising their own children, and they're having to contend with the unique challenges that being autistic can bring to that. There's no research. There's very little data about certain things that I find fascinating from working with these populations. On the ground, for instance, it would seem from the anecdata that autistic children who grow up in an autistic home do not have any that has been reported to me. So I'm going to say they do have lower rates of self-injury. However, it would also seem that they have bigger language gaps from their typically developing peers, that they acquire language later, even when there's speech therapy from an early intervention type of age. Again, I don't know if this is true. This could just be the people I've talked to, because nobody is really looking at or studying this particular issue. There are a lot of resources if you are the autistic parent of an autistic child and you're stressed out. I know there's a lot of talk about how there aren't enough services, but in reality, most people, especially professionals, will understand if you come to them and say, well, I'm really being tested by this aspect of parenting my autistic child. But there are unique aspects to parenting, even to pregnancy and childbirth, that come up for autistic parents. A lot of us have increased scrutiny from professionals in various areas. And there aren't really places within autistic culture or with professionals where we can bring these concerns. And that, I think, really does need to happen. And that's a reason for just to have this conversation in general. Then the lack of community. I think that the fragmentation between autistic parents who were diagnosed after their children and see themselves as more part of the special needs parent community, and then parents who are part of the autistic community and then had children of their own. There is a really big gap between these two groups that I'm going to talk about later. But I think that that fragmenting of our community, it makes us smaller and it hurts us. It makes us think that we're the first people to have ever gone through what we're going through, and usually we're not. Sorry, I'm just trying to advance these slides. Okay, so this is what I got when I typed autistic parenting into Pinterest. I got a lot of things, a lot of pins, all of which were about the difficulties of parenting someone who was autistic. But if you look at all of these, there is actually no discussion of what being an autistic parent is like, what parenting while autistic actually is. It's a number of things about children, and in which we've lost the idea that these children may someday grow up and may someday have children of their own. So in many cases, it's also very negative. Another thing that doesn't get mentioned, because if you looked at the last slide, you would think that allistic parents of autistic children were really the main crux, is that we're talking about, there are three types of families really. There's all allistic families, and we're not going to be talking about them right now. They're not my issue. They can have all sorts of issues, but then there are all autistic families. Both the parents and the child or children are on the spectrum, although there can be very, very different presentations, and the challenges of those groups are very rarely the same. There are all autistic families who never really get discussed. And then there are mixed families. And those are the most common types of families that there are. Mixed neurotype families, where either the parents or the child are not autistic, and how we all are able to live together in such close circumstances. To talk about all autistic families first, this picture right here of 3 blue unicorns, I don't know if you can see that, but a child actually pointed to that picture and said, you need to put this on here because they say we don't exist, all autistic families. So I put that there to really just get across that we're not unicorns. We're real people. All autistic families do definitely exist, and it's a genetic condition, and we often get along with each other. Autistic space can be a place to meet people, although it should not be used primarily for that purpose. People do meet, they fall in love, they have children, or they decide to have children in any number of contexts and form an autistic family. And that can be great. In this house, we stim, we do routines, we repeat what we say. That entire poster there is a really, really beautiful utopian vision of an all autistic family. On the other hand, there are some challenges. Some of us have different access needs than others, and especially with small children, echolalia can be really hard for autistic parents. An autistic child saying exactly the same thing over and over for 6 years, which I'm familiar with, it can be stressful sometimes for an autistic person. I see I wrote up there family-wide EF fails, which was obviously something I meant to come back and expand on later. The entire family can have a failure of executive functioning, something that has been planned. There isn't sort of a designated non-autistic person who can get everybody motivated, and so often the family can miss milestones, can have trouble participating in events that either the parent or the children would really benefit from, would like to participate in. And then there's the third one, the real connection between parents and children versus the perceived connection between parents and children. And this is from my personal experience of having been designated a cold and uninvolved mother by professionals in like my children's pediatrician's office, where it was seen as unfeeling that I was very efficient and businesslike during sick visits with my kids, that I should have been a bit more panicked or what have you. And I had kind of shut down that part of my social behavior. And so I think they didn't quite know what to make of me. I've heard of that happening at the 2 autistic parent support groups I've ever been to. I've heard of that happening a couple of times. So the question, are we the real refrigerator mothers? Well, I think often professionals see us this way. However, we have strengths. Autistic families have a few things that we're really good at. We can be very, very accepting of our children's idiosyncrasies. Cara spoke on gender nonconformity, and that is just one of the many places I've found that autistic parents deal with having unexpectedly gender variant children or children with a sexual orientation other than heterosexual much better, I think, in the aggregate. I'm sure there's a lot of individual things than the standard, because we've already moved outside of what the normal narrative is supposed to be. And so we're very accepting of other things that come up in that direction. Community. Our community, the autistic community, is very intersectional with communities that work toward, or strive toward at least, racial and economic justice, social justice generally, the wider disability community. And these are all wonderful things to be able to bring to a child and to a family. Lastly, we have empathy. Not just empathy with our children's challenges, but autistic people, they have begun to point out, can be very, very empathetic with, particularly with powerless people, with children, with people who depend on us. And while that hyper empathy can sometimes get in the way of parenting, I think it also, it's a potential strength. It provides for a good experience. Now, do I have time to get into late diagnosed parents, Katie?
3 more minutes.
3 more minutes. Late diagnosed parents who have been the focus of the work I've been doing for the past year or so. Late diagnosed parents are parents who are autistic, but they were diagnosed after their children were, often by the same practitioner who did diagnose their children. They recognize some of the challenges of their own childhood, and so it sort of went from there. These people are often caught between our 2 communities. There's the autistic community and there's the special needs parent community. Both of them are very cohesive, a very strong group identity, and they don't always get along. And these people are very much in the middle of that. The other thing is that the parent of a disabled child, as well as an undiagnosed autistic, they both go through some seriously traumatic experiences. It's hard to be either of those things. And in many cases, the late diagnosed autistic parent will tend to feel like one or the other of their communities no longer understands them. And that can be very, very painful. For some autistic parents, as I've said, the special needs community might be the first time they've ever really felt social group acceptance. And also their expertise, their special interest has often evolved to be around their child's disability and advocating for their child. And it may be the first time that their expertise has been really appreciated instead of just being seen as an obsession. A lot of autistic parents have acquired this sort of specialized knowledge because that's one of the things that autistic people do. We need to find more common ground as parent groups, and I feel that welcoming this group into the autistic community, something that as a community we should certainly talk about, might be something of a key to doing that. I held the first Disability Day of Mourning Vigil, at which parents were welcome. And this had to be done very carefully with a lot of discussion about how this was disability space. The voices of people with disabilities were privileged for this, and that it was not the time to talk about how these tragedies had happened because of a lack of services. That might be an issue you might want to discuss later. And then we had sort of debriefing post discussions without parents present about how it had worked for all of the people with disabilities there. I think that incorporating our two groups will take that level of reflection, and it's going to be hard, but I think we have to do it. As I said, at this political moment in the US, we can't afford to be a tiny group. We need to be a coalition. They need us, we need them. And late diagnosed parents are really looking for acceptance from the autistic community, but don't entirely know how to get it. Sorry, I'm just trying to fix those slides. Okay, and then mixed families, which I have already gone through. And this does get a bit into how mixed families can be very hard, and mixed families where the children or child is autistic and the parents are not can cause a certain amount of scapegoating of autism as the sort of cover for a number of unhealthy family dynamics that can go on. Yes, I'm going to skip right past this, Katie. I'm skipping right past it now. I know how long it is. Our culture, discussing bringing parents into the culture of autistic pride, that is actually a very important thing to do. I think in particular, this is the poster from the organization that I founded. Or it was, no, I want to go back. I'm so sorry.
Can you bring it back? Or wait.
Yeah, I am definitely trying to do that. There we go. Our mission statement discusses our work being at the intersecting point of disability rights, special education, and economic justice. But why that specifically is because what special education lacks is a real understanding that this is grounded in civil rights, that inclusion might more appropriately be called desegregation. And this is a model that's very resonant, I think, to a lot of underserved communities that don't really have as much access to the special needs parent community. And why I bring this up right now and why I'm ending the presentation with this is because often the best way to talk to parents who feel that the special needs community isn't speaking to them is from that civil rights perspective, because it's something I think that when we think about it, we can all agree on it. So autistic parents can often find their common ground presenting the lessons they've learned from autistic culture and wider disability culture to parents whose real only introduction has been through the special needs parent community. So that is the work that I try to do. I try to build those bridges without compromising on the civil rights of autistic people and disabled people in general. And I'm now done, Katie. I'm so sorry. I took
Don't apologize.
almost 20 minutes.
I know that all of these presentations could have been much longer because there's so much valuable information from all of you, and I really appreciate that you were able to condense them as short as you were, because we would definitely rather hear much longer presentations given the time. So hopefully we will be able to find the space to do that on this platform, as well as I'd like to be able to share your contacts so that if people have additional questions after our question and answer period, that we can elaborate even further. So before I turn it over to Tom to facilitate the Q&A, I just really quickly want to say we are recording this, and I should have said this earlier, but it will be archived and it will be posted on our website that Rebecca had shared earlier, and we can share that again in the chat. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it back to Tom to facilitate some questions and answers from the audience. And yes, if Hala, if you could stop sharing the screen just because I don't know why it's flickering, but it's the day of technical issues.
I'm trying to figure out how to do that.
First off, this was let me get something that's not right here. Hold on. This was just a fascinating presentation, very informative. Really, you know, what we were trying to do was reach out to the cutting edge. Do you folks hear me? Yes, good. So, you know, our goal for this particular panel was to really reach deep and to reach to areas where people aren't talking. And I believe we did that. We're going to give an opportunity for people in the audience to begin to ask questions. But before I do that, do any of you have questions or comments or would like to address each other in any way on what you talked about or clarification? Is there something that you want to bring up from your own presentation or from someone else's that you want to discuss?
This is Lydia. I will keep this super short because I saw we all want to say something. I was super excited by today's conversation, especially because the common theme that I saw between all four of us was that we're all talking about autistic people who are at the margins of the margins, wherever we're at. Autistic people who are at the margins in academia, autistic people who are at the margins either within the autistic community or within the parent community because they're both, autistic people who are at the margins because they're autistic and trans, autistic people who are at the margins because they're autistic and Black, Latinx, Indigenous, Asian, mixed, other people of color. And I thought that that was great, and I was happy for this conversation to happen. But my question is, what can you all do at the ICI as you move forward so that this is not the one episode where we have this conversation, but the first of many? And that's what I'll be excited about.
Great.
Yeah,
well, thank you, Lydia. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I just want to second Lydia's question as somebody who's working at ICI, because I really would like to push for ICI to be an example in terms of inclusion around all different aspects of identity and experience, and kind of live up to the Institute's name. And it seems like we might be in a position, an ideal position to start to do that. So sorry, Tom, go ahead.
No, absolutely. That's, you know, you're here pushing the envelope, looking at gender identity and autism. You're part of our community. You're part of the ICI. So we are interested and invested in looking at these issues. Absolutely. But I think that, you know, for some of us, this was more informative and things that we hadn't really thought of before. Personally, the issue of intersectionality wasn't new to me, but was fascinating to me is when Sara talked about the intersectionality as well as privilege and existing in different worlds. And that's something that I hadn't thought of before, but it's a very complex relationship that exists that I think is important for us to consider. The male, pale, and stale. I'd never heard that, but I think I'm going to have to begin using that. I think it's important for us to include people at the table who have the experiences. And I think that's something that we at the ICI are trying to do and trying to do better at. I think the fact that we're having this and beginning the conversation, I think this is just very early and beginning conversations, but I think this is critically important for us as a research institute and as a technical assistance and training institute to really understand the issues and principles that you brought forward today. Who else would like to weigh in, or to Sarah? I think, let me see if I can unmute you here. There you go. Go ahead, Sarah.
Thank you, Tom. So I want to, I guess not apologize. I won't apologize for my crip time or neurodivergent temporality, but I will say that it's never easy to go first. And and that I was very ill for the past 3 days, and I was even at the emergency room. So forgive me if it took me a little bit to actually get in motion with what I was trying to share. I also forgot to share something so important. I did speak to my identities, and Katie also spoke to them, but I just wanted to I guess reiterate the fact that I was born and raised in Colombia in South America, and I'm an immigrant in the United States, and so that I guess that's another I guess side of non-privilege that gets overlooked with projections of whiteness and able-bodiedness onto my flesh, and something that causes tremendous dissonance in my life. Because I am definitely everything but white, and I am definitely everything but able-bodied. So I wanted to say that, and the last thing I wanted to say as well was to thank Hala. I did, to thank all of us, of course, all of you, but I wrote it in the chat box. I wanted to thank Hala for actually speaking to language, which is actually my focus and my expertise, but I didn't really touch on my reclamation of identity first language. And that's so super important, Hala, because I know that our community, the various disability communities, are very rich, fragmented, and multiple and various, and we all utilize different forms of language and language use and identification. So I did shared a little bit of a brief explanation as to why I choose identity first language in the little chat box. So speaking a little bit about the social model and medical models of disability, if in case anybody wanted to say something about that. Thank you.
Anyone else like to weigh in? And go ahead, Hella.
Well, in particular, I really wanted to see if Lydia could talk a little bit, because one of the big things I've been working on lately is this kind of parent work with underserved communities. And if you think that adult diagnosis of autism is difficult, adult diagnosis of parents of color is especially difficult. The diagnosis for a child can take years because there's a tendency to ignore the fact that it might be autism and put things down to behavior problems with certain populations, for instance. Then when you do meet the parents, and it becomes apparent that it might be helpful for the parents to identify that they're autistic, that is almost impossible in terms of finding practitioners who are actually willing or able to recognize autistic parents of color. And so I was just kind of wondering, Lydia, if you could tell me if you've run into that situation at all or had any thoughts on that.
This is Lydia. Thanks for that question, Hella. My experience in discussions with other autistic people of color are that many of us aren't diagnosed. When we are, it tends to be later than our white counterparts. And then when you add further complications, if your family is an immigrant family, if the main language is not English, if you come from a very tight-knit cultural community based around shared ethnicity, shared faith, the likelihood of getting that diagnosis drops further. And at the same time, I've heard from many adult autistic people of color two conflicting stories. On the one hand, there's autistic adults of color who desperately want a diagnosis but can't get it. And they'll be told at every turn by practitioners, the neuropsychologists, the psychiatrists, whoever it is that's doing the evaluation, that they simply don't meet the criteria. And it's almost always inevitably for very thinly veiled, coded racist reasons.
Yes.
And on the other hand, there's autistic adults of color who did get diagnosed at some point in their childhood, sometime in the K through 22, before 22 era, and who absolutely hate the fact that they were diagnosed autistic. Because as soon as they were diagnosed autistic, and of course this happens to white autistic people too, but as soon as they were diagnosed autistic, not only did that mean that they might have gotten shoved into applied behavior analysis, which we as autistic activists know is an incredibly abusive practice. Those of you listening may not know that. You may not know that virtually every autistic adult that all of us know who's ever had ABA at some point in their childhood now has post-traumatic stress disorder from it. You probably also don't know that it comes from conversion therapy for gay and trans people, that it was invented by the same person who ran the feminine boys experiment that punished and ultimately ended up converting into using electric shocks. That he was the pioneer before the JRC was, in order to modify the behavior of kids that were supposed to be masculine boys, but were displaying effeminate behavior. And that's where ABA comes from. But these autistic people of color, when they were kids, they got diagnosed at some point. They got pushed into ABA. They got pushed into social skills classes that were very paternalistic, incredibly patronizing, and assume whiteness, like a social skills training on how to interact with the police. Trust the police. They're always there to help you. They're your friend. And that's not something that you should ever tell a person of color, especially if they're Black or a dark-skinned Latinx or dark-skinned Indigenous person. You shouldn't tell someone that, because you're setting up that person to trust that police will always be there for them when police are most likely to shoot them, kill them, to arrest them. And so these autistic adults of color, when they got diagnosed, that diagnosis was held against them. It was held as evidence as to why they were a disruptive and unruly student, shouldn't belong in school. It was held as to why a more appropriate placement would be segregated, restricted into a specialized school out of district placement, why they're more of a candidate for referral to the juvenile criminal legal system. And at the same time, our white counterparts, when they get diagnosed in school, if something happens where they're threatened with suspension or expulsion, or they are suspended, they are expelled, a school files charges, this does happen to white autistic kids, then it becomes, oh, but wait, maybe we should stop, maybe we shouldn't file these charges, maybe we shouldn't pursue this discipline, because this kid, they'll say person first language, this kid has autism, and that really means that it's just behavior that they need some help for, and if we just support them, they won't do it. Then they get subjected to more ABA. And meanwhile, the autistic kids of color are shunted off. So for the question of what is the issue with diagnosis, there isn't a straight up answer. Sometimes diagnosis is helpful, sometimes it's not. Cultural and racial issues come into play when people assume the only people that could be diagnosed are white boys, and maybe men, but mostly white boys. And then we're not believed. Within our own communities, we're shunted out. We're told that it's something to be ashamed of, or something that you can't have that as a white people problem. Or in the autistic community, we're told, well, you're an anomaly, and we're made to feel excluded. We're made to feel like we don't belong unless we try to put on the cloak of whiteness and assimilate.
Hella, go ahead.
Okay. I just wanted to respond to the example that you gave, because I thought that about the difficulty of diagnosing a child who is acting out in school, because that is almost exactly what got me started doing the work that I'm doing now. A Black or brown or poor family will often not meet the suspension or expulsion of an autistic child with the same level of, no, I want a manifestation determination hearing right now, like fervor that a private advocate can bring. Whereas I think that in order to actually have any sort of justice in the schools, then the same level of advocacy needs to reach all of our students. And it isn't. Diagnosis, that affects diagnosis a lot. It does also affect discipline and accommodations. Do you think that, well, you know what, I'm gonna ask you, we will have another conversation because otherwise I'll take the whole
I
period.
can tell you that I'm beginning a fellowship this fall where I'll be specifically working in special education advocacy as an autistic person of color. That's why hopefully I pass the bar next one. But one of the reasons that I set out to do this is because the vast majority of advocates in this arena are white, non-disabled, or both. And I don't see very many people like me who are in that arena and who therefore are coming from a perspective where I'm not saying that mine will be identical to every client I will ever have. It certainly won't, especially if clients belong to groups I don't. Like, I'm not Black, I'm not Native American, I'm not a transgender woman, but I am a non-binary person, I am an East Asian person of color, and that plus being autistic and disabled means that I'm in a position, hopefully, to push for more of us to be doing this work, because you're absolutely right. There aren't enough of us doing it. And because of that, there aren't enough people who need this type of advocacy who are able to access it in a way that actually understands where they're coming from, their multiple cultural backgrounds, and what happens with the intersected oppressions that they face. So I will note that we have another question, which is for all of us, I believe, maybe, or just me. I can't tell. From Gretchen Ikema. He says, am I understanding you correctly that you view person-centered language as a negative thing? I think all four of us can say, yeah, we don't use it. I mean, I don't think I'm speaking for everyone else, but.
I would say, I'll
Why don't you go ahead, Sarah?
I'll speak to that, Gretchen. No, we don't. I mean, sorry. No, I'm not using we. I and other many autistic colleagues with whom I am in conversation with, we do not see it as a negative thing. No, we see it as a product of a movement that's gradually transformed, that began with the disability rights movement in the late 60s. I have a little blog article that I wrote about this. If you would want that, it's very clear, it's very simple language. Anyhow, at that point, activists on the ground were fighting strongly and intently to reclaim and to recenter the humanity of disabled people, who were and still are institutionalized and being brutalized in institutions and not being recognized as human beings, right? And then there is a transition and a transformation and a gradual development of the disability rights movement into something completely different that's brought about by people of color and non-binary change agents. That's the disability justice movement. The disability justice movement really develops out of the social model of disability in conjunction with the cultural model and integrative models. And those models recognize that there is a process that disables people, people with who embody different, with different forms of embodiment. And so from that emerges identity first language to really focus on the fact that disablement is a social process and not a natural occurring status or category. And the autistic movement of the 90s in the United States was one of the pioneers of identity first language. So no, a lot of us don't see it as a negative thing. We see it as a product of our very complex, rich experiences in very many disabled communities. And I personally, and I know many of my colleagues do too, we respect people's right to identify as they see fit. What I don't, and other of us don't respect, is when we identify with whatever we choose to identify, we're told, no, you shouldn't be using this language because that language is not correct, right? So every person has a right to identify. I do not tell someone who uses person first language, no, you should use identity first language. I'm not policing their forms of self-identification. So I just wanted to say that.
Great, thank you all. This has been a tremendous, informative, educational conversation we had today. Thank you all for your sharing your stories and your experience and your professional lives with us. And I'm going to turn it over to Katie now to wrap us up and send us on. But I really want to thank you all. It's been a tremendous success today. I really appreciate the conversations that we've had. Really, I think pushing the envelope and really at the cutting edge of this conversation. So thank you all for being part of this conversation. Katie, do you want to take it away?
Yes, thank you, Tom. I just really quickly before we end want to give Caro a chance to say something because I know you were really had something to say. So.
Oh no, I think Sara covered everything that I might have wanted to say about language. I just didn't know if there were other attendees who had questions that maybe got neglected. Like, is there any time to address questions from attendees? You know, people, you know, I really just again want to thank everybody for attending the webinar and definitely want to be able to address their input and their questions.
This is Lydia. There was a question earlier that I answered in the chat box. There was a question from Lauren, I don't have the full, Lauren Weiss, asking, can you address the importance of unrestricted grants as opposed to funds provided for a specific purpose? I answered it in the chat box. Basically what I said was, we do ask applicants to tell us what category of funding they're applying for, and the categories include an other box as well. We also ask them to give us more details. Applicants can give as much or as little as they want. We've had as little as one sentence. Some of them have sent multiple paragraphs, including a line-by-line budget, which was very overwhelming to me. But it allows people to apply for funds for needs that sometimes people can't get individual help for, or where they can, it's either you can only get it one at a time, but not together. And you have to be on a waiting list for an extremely long time and provide an extensive amount of documentation, gatekeeping that can keep a lot of low-income people of color and disabled people away from being able to get that funds. And we simply hold people to an honor system where if we give you funds, we'll be making the first disbursements either this week or this weekend, that we assume you're using the funds for what you told us you applied for. And if it happens that you end up not using it for that purpose, we assume, unless there's some very specific concrete reason to believe otherwise, that you probably still needed that money for some other purpose for your life or survival, and that it's not our job to try to micromanage what you need to do to keep existing in this world.
Thank you, Lydia. So thank you all again for presenting. This was excellent. It will be archived, posted on our website that Rebecca shared in the chat box. I really appreciate it. I wish we had more time. We'd love to hear from all of you again, and also to share your contact with the people who have attended today. So, and I believe Rebecca also shared our Facebook and other social media links where you can continue the conversation there as well. So thank you again. We'll follow up with the recording and all the rest of the information. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.